Off topic. Could we put together a top 10 list of vegans who have ruined their lives through YouTube? Right? Like people for whom YouTube or YouTube fame or even YouTube success has been or brought about their ruination. Like obviously, Nikocado Avocado is going to rank in the top 10, right? Henya Mania, obviously going to rank in the top 10. Debatably, though, Kristen Leo, suicidal in her splendor, in her rags and her riches, nevertheless suicidal, miserable, like it's a gilded cage, right? I mean, you could do a general global top 10 list of people who have ruined their lives by succeeding on YouTube. But then like the vegan top 10 list could be an interesting one. Okay. How did I end up watching The Mandalorian? I was drawn into this step by step through a series of false assumptions. I think the first time I Googled how much does it cost to get 1 month out of Disney Plus was just because of this kind of ethical question of people asking for support on Patreon. Vegans especially, but YouTubers in general asking you to donate support. It's like, hey, look, guys, if you can buy the entire history of Disney intellectual property for $8.99 a month, what sense does it make to be donating $10 and $20 to a YouTuber? And a lot of these YouTubers upload one video a week or less, right? Like, how do you square this in your mind? And then since then, it nagged at the back of my mind. Could it be that the Disney Corporation is translating and subtitling its schlock movies into Chinese? And I Googled around and I saw people commenting on Reddit or commenting on Twitter. I couldn't find any firm information on this, but it seemed to me I should be able to study Chinese, educate myself in Chinese, improve my Chinese by watching these terrible films made or owned by the Disney Corporation with Chinese subtitles, Chinese dubbing. Now, in the case of The Mandalorian in particular, I knew the format, I knew the aesthetic, I knew the pastiche even, because it is in some ways a pastiche of Wild West and samurai movie elements. I knew that this was going to be a sweeping drama populated by men of principle, men of much violence and few words, that there were going to be terse, profound statements in overwrought yet emotionless English. You know, I knew exactly the aesthetic the writers were going for, and I thought that would be interesting to work through in Chinese. And indeed, so having now seen it, this is not a spoiler, it contains such vaguely spiritual catchphrases as, "This is the way." It might be interesting to see how you render that in Chinese. And indeed, as with the catchphrases of the original Star Wars movies from the 1970s and 1980s, there are these peculiar Taoist overtones, or perhaps Taoist undertones throughout. "This is the way" is the catchphrase here, whereas in the very first film, "May the Force be with you." I thought this could be an interesting way to study and practice Chinese, and obviously you could switch back and forth between the Chinese and the English. I was wrong. A gamble of $8.99. I'm very glad I didn't sign up for 1 year of service. So far, I have not found a single thing within Disney Plus that offers Chinese subtitles and dubbing. But The Mandalorian in particular had no Chinese whatsoever. Right? Nevertheless, I watched The Mandalorian. And also, by the way, then I was thinking as second best, maybe I could at least use this to practice French. But I would want both subtitles and dubbing, and it didn't have that. Kind of things had only one or the other. I was like, wow, they seem really committed to like the Finnish and the Swedish market for some reason, and that is about it. Like it's just very strange what you do and don't get in the subtitles and dubbing. And yes, I mean, shout out to all my viewers from Finland and Sweden. The size of the Chinese market is compelling. The number of people who speak Chinese, even within California, is a huge market. So it is very surprising how little of the Chinese language is to be found there. And yeah, this may seem strange to you, but if you're studying Chinese or trying to motivate yourself to put more hours into Chinese, you can't really do Game of Thrones. In terms of vocabulary and so on, you can't really do Game of Thrones in Chinese. A lot of stuff in terms of Chinese fable and fiction that originates from China, the type of vocabulary and the type of sentence structure and so on can be wildly irrelevant to the modern era. Okay, so this having been said, I actually wrote and published an article in Chinese. I can write another one now, specifically about The Mandalorian. The article I already wrote was really asking the question, what was the appeal of Star Wars in the first place? And one of the main points I made was this. There was a time when it was really startling and new to think about the future in terms of a return to feudalism and a return to slavery. Now, George Lucas absolutely followed the cue of the very first Dune novel. And the author of the very first Dune novel is a very strange guy. And when the first novel only came out, most people, I think, imagined this was satirical. So yeah, I'm sorry, I forget. I think this is in the first and the second novel, both. There's this sort of repeated mention that, oh, don't worry about democracy. People prefer to live under a tyranny. They prefer to have a government that they hate. And it's a very, very strange set of examinations of and reflections on tyranny in the Islamic world, both back then in, say, the 1960s and 1970s, and 100 years earlier in, say, the 1860s, 70s, and still applicable to today. But also, part of what Dune was responding to was the then still unfolding history of the British Empire. I mean, put it this way, in the 1960s, there were a lot of people alive who had really been part of the British Empire in their youth, who'd been part of the unapologetic period of overt British imperialism. And that included very strange encounters between British European attitudes and the kings of exotic, unfathomable deserts and ocean ports on the edges of those deserts and so on. There was this strange shadow cast. Now, the author of Dune, however, was not British. He was a white American, and he was also fascinated by desert ecology. There are a few other elements that came together there. Now, the precise history of the haphazard way in which George Lucas took these elements together and ended up stumbling into the first Star Wars movie is incredibly well recorded. It's incredibly well documented. Sort of the intermediate stages of the development of the script have been preserved and ossified. You can compare and contrast them. The influence of other people that came in through the editor's room and how the significance and structure of the plot was changed between when the film was, like the first draft of the film and the final product. It's in a very spontaneous way, the differences between Dune and the final product of the first Star Wars movie, they increased over time in an unplanned, unforeseen, spontaneous way. George Lucas himself didn't really have a clear idea of how this film would end up, or you could say the way the film ended up was very different from his original clear idea. In looking at The Mandalorian, probably the greatest praise I can give it is this should have been the second Star Wars film. I really feel that everything else in the Star Wars canon, in the Star Wars universe after that very first film was garbage, or at any rate represented a tremendous decrease in quality, inspiration, and interest, including the fact that the political potential the first film played with is discarded and comes to nothing. So to mention this very briefly, a lot of you probably saw this but didn't really think about it. In the first three films, meaning the 1970s, 1980s trilogy, what do you mean by the first three films? What you mean by the first three films may be a bit confusing. The original trilogy, people like to say. In those first three films, Luke Skywalker has a dream. He sees his enemy decapitated, but then when he takes the mask off, the decapitated head, it's his own face, right? So he sees his own face, that he himself had become Darth Vader, right? There was a stage in the development of the scripts. Again, this is preserved for history, perhaps to the embarrassment of George Lucas, perhaps his delight. I don't know how he feels about it. But the fundamental concept of the original trilogy was that Luke Skywalker would go from being the hero to being the villain, that he would become himself the despotic ruler of the universe, replacing Darth Vader and the Emperor. And that never happened, right? Like, he would discover that he had become what the revolution had been revolting against. This also has a certain kind of meaning for American history. It could have all kinds of different implications. Now, where did that idea come from? Before even the second volume of the Dune series was published, to my knowledge, the author gave interviews discussing the contrast between the first volume and the second volume and where the plot was going. I have seen one of these interviews. So I believe even before the second book is in print, people have been explicitly told this is the big theme that those books are playing with. Now again, the Dune books, I forget how many, there are more and more sequels, and it deals with more and more themes, but at least in the first two books, this was one of the striking issues. And again, people thought it was satirical in those first couple of Dune books, this notion like, oh, don't worry about democracy. People prefer to have a government they hate and resent. People prefer to live under tyranny. And for most white Americans, the Dune books were the first time they had heard words like jihad, right? The whole vocabulary of Muslim fundamentalism appears there with very, very slight changes in spelling, I assume out of political sensitivity. But this is a bleak glimpse into a religious fundamentalism in the future universe, religious fundamentalism or extremism even, and return to feudalism, return to slavery, return to arranged marriages, return to political arrangements of who rules, who's in charge, and who is a commoner, determined by arranged marriages. It's what do you mean? So in the future we all go back to the Dark Ages? What a stimulating or shocking concept. Now, in Star Wars, again, from the very first Star Wars film, there is no strategy. There is no storyteller's conceit. There is no point. In this really strange, stumbling way, George Lucas took these ideas that were maybe already inchoate or disorganized in Dune and made them even more of an incoherent jumble and presented to the audience. Now, I'd say in the very first film, it is stimulating, it is interesting. I would point out that in the Dune books, fundamentally, the religion of the Emperor is the one true religion. It goes on. One of the later books is called God Emperor of Dune. So the religion is real, the magic is real, like the magic of the spice and the hallucinations caused by the spice, all this crap. There's no ambiguity. Like the magic that they believe in and this religion that ultimately rules the universe, it's completely real and you have no choice but to submit to it, like your intellectual attitude towards it, doesn't it? The very first Star Wars movie, by contrast, presents us with a universe where the true religion of the Force is one that nobody believes in. It has somehow become incredibly obscure or forgotten. Nobody seems sure if the Jedi Knights really existed or if they're just a fable. It's openly said on screen many times that the Force it's just an idea, nobody believes in it, it's just crap, this kind of thing. Now, there are inconsistencies. Toward the very end of the first film, before they go out in the final heroic mission, the leader of their army, the rebel army, says, May the Force be with you. He says this thing out of the Jedi religion, which it totally is incoherent. It totally contradicts the in-universe, structure of the plot. Wait a minute. This isn't supposed to be like the Catholic Church in the 15th century where they give a blessing to the army before they go off. This is supposed to be this kind of obscure, forgotten, and persecuted religion. It's also hinted at many times that something has happened where the Jedi Knights have been persecuted into obscurity or vice versa and so on. And then again, it's also, there's tension surrounding the fact that one of the senior figures on the Empire side, Darth Vader, is part of this despised old-fashioned religion that openly nobody else takes seriously. Okay, now that's interesting. That's a lot more interesting than Dune, right? Dune is, the role of religion in Dune is fundamentally banal. It's just fundamentally not interesting in my opinion. And this is a much more stimulating notion that there is this vague force in the universe, which you could say is borrowed from really bad English translations of Taoist texts that were available in the 1960s. I want to say this to you straight up. the actual text of the Chuangzi and the Liezi and the Laozi, you will not find this religion in the real ancient Chinese text. But definitely, there were a lot of groovy 1960s attempts to popularize Taoism, and it was there's some inspiration in the air at that time. So this is a bastardized, westernized version of the force of Islam pervading the universe. Okay, so what do we have in The Mandalorian? What's so refreshing, what's so stimulating, is that we get back to those fundamentals that made the very first film worth seeing. And in my opinion, the absence of those fundamentals make the more recently created films not worth seeing. So I'm referring to the prequels. To me, it's unforgivably terrible filmmaking. Badly, there's just absolutely nothing about the prequels worth not even once. Don't even take your kids to see them. A lot of people say they're still good as kids' movies. I wouldn't even say that. All right. So in The Mandalorian, I sort of wish this had come out second. You had just the very first Star Wars movie, and then nothing, and then we have The Mandalorian. And what's interesting is, in some ways, it is engaging in what, in the parlance of our time, what's called fan service. It is making copious, needless references back to the canonical lore of the first several films. Beggar's Canyon is mentioned for no reason. There are all these different places, Mos Eisley. There are all these watchwords and allusions and stuff. I'm cursed with a good memory. Really, it's not that I'm a Star Wars fan, but while I was watching it, I was remembering all these ridiculous place names and made up alien catchphrases. What do you want to say? The jargon of the earlier films is still loaded in there. There are these kinds of references to precise technology and so on. But in season 1, they have discarded entirely, the Jedi religion, the Jedi worldview, and they've started again with this other religion, the religion of the Mandalorians. And it's fundamentally interesting in the same way. In this case, you have to say the Mandalorians are in the position of being not just a despised minority, but a persecuted minority living in hiding. So some of you might compare this to the status of Jews being persecuted by Christians in the 20th century. You could also think about Catholics under Protestant majority countries in Renaissance Europe, or Protestants under Catholic majority countries in Renaissance Europe. I mean, it's like many scenarios historically of one religion being persecuted to the brink of non-existence by the other. Their temple they meet in secret and so on. The origin of this idea of Mandalore and the Mandalorians, very briefly, has come about, again, to use my favorite image, like a can of tomato soup rolling down a staircase, through a series of unplanned and spontaneous adaptations. It actually begins with the Star Wars holiday special. And in a world full of absolutely terrible Star Wars movies, that always tops the top 10 list as the absolute worst thing ever created with a Star Wars name or logo on it. But in that, there was a short animated film about a character they came up with called Boba Fett. Attempt after attempt was made to make Boba Fett and his storyline into something interesting, and certainly something that would sell toys or sell Happy Meals, something that could be commercialized. And I believe the most important transformations took place in the cartoon series, the Clone Wars cartoon series, and then to some extent also in the comic books. I don't think in this case it was in the novels, maybe also, where eventually what they came up with was a way to redeem the design of this character by saying, okay, Boba Fett himself was not a Mandalorian, but he must have killed a Mandalorian and stolen a Mandalorian's armor, and this armor has a special significance for this religious order called the Mandalorians, and then they could go from there and start inventing this new mythos surrounding this new religion. Okay? So, we have been returned to the sort of fundamental assumptions that made the very first film interesting and worth watching in the first place. Before we watched the first episode, I said to my girlfriend, because at this time I was only interested in this as a way of studying Chinese or practicing Chinese, I said to her, look, no matter how good this is, no matter how much other people may praise it, fundamentally, this is space pirates. This is going to be a crappy laser gun action movie. There's not going to be a lot here to appreciate. By that standard, I can say, hey, it's better than, it's more interesting than Space Pirates. And clearly, we have foreshadowed that in the second season, we're going to get some kind of meaningful contrast between the worldview of the Mandalorians, who have been established as the sort of anti-Jedi, as the opposite of the diametrically opposed faction. Their religion is in some sense profoundly the opposite of the worldview of the Jedi, and the Jedi themselves. And the character who's been most exploited commercially, the Baby Yoda character, is some kind of naturally gifted Jedi character who will draw these two worldviews together. Okay, I'm interested. All right. The bad news is there is quite a lot of bad writing and quite a lot of bad acting if you are going through this scene by scene. Does it matter? Yes, especially given that these are sort of veteran producers, veteran showrunners, veteran directors. Given the vintage of the talent, it was shocking to me that I think every actor under the age of 30 was just abominably awful. Like there were plenty of older actors where you go, oh wow, okay, this guy knows how to read a script, this guy knows how to act. And there were several points where I said to Melissa out loud, oh, this guy knows how to do a table reading where he takes a badly written set of lines and makes them sing, makes them work as if it were well written. Where again, these are some actors 50 years old and older, where you really felt that they were veteran actors who did a good job. There is quite a lot of bad writing. There is quite a lot of bad acting, and there were a lot of things that were objectively wrong with it in that sense, where it's like, how did this get past the workshop stage? How did this get past the table reading? Why didn't people sit there and say, okay, let's rework this. Let's do this a second time and make this work. In the year 2020, with a big budget production like this, that it was so flawed in that way came to me as a big surprise. With that having been said, what are the all-time best Batman movies? You're comparing any given Batman movie to the reality of what other Batman movies are. It's okay, you come up with the top two. The very best Batman movie may still objectively be a bad movie, but it's just better than all the other Batman movies. I would absolutely say this is in the all-time top 2 list for Star Wars. And you know what? Some people, I think really, you could give this number 1. You could really say that this is the single greatest Star Wars film. Taking season 1 together and regarding it as one movie, you could say it's better than the original film. Bit of a strange comparison. But at any rate, it is, in my opinion, either number 1 or number 2. And look, guys, what can you accomplish in mainstream fiction? I think what you can do is take a crowbar to the window of bourgeois conformist ordinariness in the society you're living in. Like, people are living inside this hothouse, and you come along with a crowbar and you try to open up that window just a bit and say, hey, there's another way of looking at life. There's another way of thinking about the world. You know what I mean? There's something I can do to try to, jilt you out of this kind of conformist reverie you're in, to try to look at things from a new angle. And it's very interesting that a book as utterly kind of politically eccentric as the original Dune had this shocking effect on a whole generation. I don't think, by the way, in 2020, I think the new film is going to be a complete artistic failure in this respect. I don't think it will accomplish that, partly because it's 2020. It's not the 1960s or 1970s anymore. Things really changed. And partly because I don't believe in the director and for other miscellaneous reasons, okay? But, yes, the original Star Wars film, it really led to people asking new questions. And it still is moving. I mean, it is emotionally moving, and it is intellectually moving for me as a cynical old man, just to have depicted men of principle, people who say, this is my word, on my honor, this is what I'm going to do. This is fundamentally what life's about. And we live in a society where you could live your whole life in California and never meet even one man of principle. You could never meet anyone who has any principle that they value more than their own short-term self-interest, their own selfish self-indulgence, for lack of a better term. And in bringing together these medieval aspects like knightly honor, living by a code of honor like a knight in medieval times, allegedly. Put in the asterisk, put in the footnote that, well, that wasn't really what medieval times were like. Regardless, like fiction, the fictionalized account of medieval times. Presenting that in a futuristic setting and raising those questions for how we live our lives today. What is worth fighting for? What is worth dying for? What is freedom? What is slavery? What is empire? What is a republic? What is a democracy? What is freedom? It's all there. And that, in short, is what makes The Mandalorian worth watching.